like to thank you for being here, first of all, and thank you for LastCon for having me as a speaker. So what are we going to talk about today? Supply chain attacks and supply chain security have been in the headlines, I think, for a couple of years now, at least, not to say maybe 5 years. And specifically on those years, we have seen a lot of traffic, a lot of attention. Thank you. Attention to the supply chain and software security specifically. Now, I'm not going to relate to supply chain in general because supply chain is much more than software, but we are currently focusing on software, so this is why it's important. But in this talk, we're going to focus more specifically on the design stage of software, which means that no one should even write a single line of code in order to get to affect the supply chain in this case. And I'm going to go over why it's an overlooked risk and how can we, some real-world examples, of course, and after all that, let's talk about how can we fix that in the future. So I won't going to go over my bio or something, but this is my contact. I'm available via Twitter or email or LinkedIn. You can find me up, hit me up, and let's talk. What's important for us to understand, first of all, is what is a supply chain, traditional supply chain landscape. And when we discuss supply chain, and I'm involved in multiple standards regarding supply chain security nowadays, this is the usual scheme. Now, you are always starting from the developer itself, maybe some suppliers here, so maybe the directionality of the graph is not always accurate, but in general, the general flow is that the developer needs to write source code. Developer might also be part of the architecture and design, but it all starts with the developer. Now, this notion have been extra careful with it across maybe 3 to 5 years now, with the agile development taking place into cloud native applications as well, which means that the development lifecycle have been merging this kind of design and code. So there is no legitimate split between the design stage to the code stage in agile development. That I'm saying with a bit of salt on that, because this is not entirely true, and that's part of my point. But usually that's why we see that developer starts the initiative, have the initiative on the source code itself, and that's why development starts there. So developers start with developing code. The code enters a build system, maybe. This build system can be affected by dependencies of the code, which are third-party dependencies, packages that you are using, open source packages or not open source. And by that, entering some kind of a CI/CD system. Now there is a packaging system for that, and then deployment. And overall, the consumer, you, me, everyone, are consuming this kind of software in any mean that is necessary for that kind of application to process and execute. Also important here, this is as I said, the usual cadence and usual graph that we see on cloud-native applications, but also we can minimize that in non-cloud native, so don't be discouraged by the CI/CD part. Different attack vectors are marked maybe interjections are marked in a red square, which means in every point and challenge on this kind of flow, we have several scenarios. I'm not going to cover them all today, of course. As I said, this is the traditional way. I'm going to the advanced ways also on the next slide. But on each and every step of the way, there is something that is a threat or a risk to your application or your application security. If you would like, just as a reference, there is one very particular standard named SLSA, SLSA, started by Google and then with others as well. And also we are part of this standard working group. And this is why you will see, once you look up supply chain threats, supply chain risks, security, etc., standards, you'll notice SLSA or SLSA right away. So this is, as I said, a traditional way to look at it. The missing part is exactly beyond or just above the developer, is the design step. What happens exactly and why design step is separate, this is of course, the intention of this talk is, first of all, to convince you there is a design that is overarching, even if the developer is designing the software, him or herself. But also, we should always look at this kind of step because it's very, very dangerous. Think of the implications, just before I'm starting with real-world examples, of a risk that is determined not by the code you are writing, but by other variables or other external entities that are not related to the developer. So the developer cannot even excuse himself for this kind of deficiency or security risk or threat. And by that, this can pose a much greater challenge to the developer, or maybe even beyond that. And I'll get, as I said, to several examples of global implications for those kind of threats. So in order to be a bit more constructive about how to approach that, I invented some kind of a taxonomy, nothing too strict, but at least to have some sense of what are the top 3 risks we are viewing as design level risks or threats when we are discussing this kind of design step. We're going to cover 3 of those, and each one will be following in a real world example. This is very important maybe to note before we dwell into that, is that there is none of my intention is to pick on someone specifically. I will, as I said, real world examples mean that I need to name names, I need to name maybe corporations, maybe entities, but this is not the intention this is not my intention to pick someone else, someone from the crowd, but I'm saying that it can happen all the time, and this is just one example that I chose to show you. The first one will be environmental constraints. We'll start with that. Then compliance and law, and the malicious influencer, which is maybe, and I'm here also pretty convinced, this is the most impactful one in terms of what kind of implications can be for this malicious actor to have this kind of footprint in the design steps. Let's start with the environmental constraints. And one more thing I would like to disclaim before I begin this kind of spiel, that if you have any kind of objection, question, whatever, just speak out. Don't wait for the end of the, you can wait, of course, to the end of this of the slide deck and then ask the question, but don't be discouraged by asking. This is part of that, and I'm feeling that a discourse about it will be much more healthier than just keep a question that bothers you all the time. So environmental constraints, what does it mean? The definition that of course we can define it maybe a bit better, but the general definition is that when design and actual coding stages are not a continuous step, meaning that there is some kind of a dilation between the design step and the coding practice. Maybe it's even not the same person designing the system than those that are developing it. Maybe there is a very big corporation, there is some kind of a politics, or maybe some divisions between you are the architect, you are going to architect the system, and you are the developer, and you are going to follow. And maybe there is some kind of a conversation between them, and maybe not. If you've been to Chris Roberts and Charles' a keynote yesterday, they explained it very, very clearly. This is a very key point on everything we do in security, the process itself, talking between people. And I think that part of the deal of why they double click on this kind of thing that might be maybe trivial to our ears is that it's trivial to think about it. It's very non-trivial to do that and to follow those kind of steps. So after that kind of structuring or enveloping this kind of risk, let's talk about a real-world example that I would like to put out. And this world example is related to hardware security, or excuse me, IoT security, not the hardware itself. And the system of choice, someone knows about this kind of system, Sonoff. This is I see some head bobbling there. Sonoff is a very simple device, a very simple circuit that all it does, it has some very clever mechanics, but very simple, as you can see. This is a very simple board in any kind of mean that's supposed to replace your switch, and from now on the switch is automatic, or at least some kind of a smart home application you can connect to. So think about any kind of switch, anything you would like to have an automated, or at least on smart home appliances, you turn it up by buying this kind of Sonoff. It's just a few bucks, and replacing your switch with that. So this is a switch on-off. That's why it's called Sonoff. Now, why I'm explaining about that? It's a not very interesting board in general, but maybe one thing to say about it is in the center you have one chip. All of the other things are not really chips. You have diodes, you have capacitors, you have transformer, excuse me. You have some switches and capacitors of several sorts, and some air gaps as well. But overall, very, very simple. You have one specific thing that I said is a very important chip, is the SoC system on chip, which is the ESP82 family, more specifically the ESP8266. And there is a reason why I'm excluding this kind of ESPP specifically. Why it's important for us to understand this is the next step here. ESP82 family is a very clever chip. It was invented around 2013, and it was crucial to the development of IoT worldwide. Part of it was the inception of this. This can be reading Arduino code as well. So this is very native to Arduino. So if you ever develop in Arduino, it will be seamless for you. And second, it also accepts Python. So this is why the inception of this chip was very, very rapid through 2013 to today, actually. And this was one of the first iterations of the chip. And again, why it's important? Because that also tells you why it's so cheap to manufacture this kind of design. But cheap doesn't mean it takes very little time. Hardware design specifically takes time. It's always in dilation to code, at least unless you are a single developer, and this way maybe you can prototype and stuff like that. But in general, between prototyping to the actual board, there is a lot to go through. And in this case, Sonoff has a very particular protocol named MQTT. The MQTT protocol is important for many IoT devices. I won't go into explain about the MQTT protocol, but what is interesting about it is it has two modes. One encrypted, and the other one is not. Or one is SSL, or TLS, whatever you want to call it, and the other one is just plain text. And you can see where I'm going with it. This is a very simple board. And when you read one of the most common code bases to put on this board is the Tasmota one, which actually exclaiming you have a definition file, you can switch the things on and off. And one of the things that was by default missed out was the experimental use of TLS. Why it was disabled by default? Because it was very dangerous to use SSL because it doesn't have much memory. This kind of chip have one memory for all of its functioning. So 1 megabyte of memory is a very, as you can figure out, is very, very low. Not too low, so you can also have very short appliances, but once encryption gets into this kind of scheme, this can blow up very, very quickly, quite literally, by the way. I blew quite a few of those in some experimentations. So it is disabled with good intention. Now, of course, this is something that the environment constrains the developer. So if the developer wants to have that, and also the other part of the sentence is that if you are running SSL, don't use any other option that is available on the device, which practically that mean that you can't use SSL on those devices. Now, what would you think will be the fix for that? Now, one particular path you can take is being a very, very clever engineer. Maybe a very clever engineer, and we have seen that in the past, will figure out an inventive way to circumvent this kind of environment constraint. But again, it deserves a lot of effort in order to do that, maybe less effort than redesigning the board. And second, it's not promised that this kind of effort will give you any value at the end of it. Maybe, in other words, maybe it's practically impossible to have it on the chip. So in those cases, specifically in the Sonoff cases, I will reveal to you that in revision 3, what you saw was revision 1. Revision 2 was very similar to revision 1. They reinvented the board altogether. It looks the same. It doesn't speak the same. It just looks the same on the surface of it. It uses another chip, with the same family, but the successor of the ESP8266, which has, coincidentally, much more memory than before. And that, I won't say fixed the problem, but at least gave the developers the breadth of or bandwidth to use more memory, and by that to be able to comply with SSL as well. So what we see here is a non-malicious, of course. As I said, the malicious part we'll get to, and the third type of attack, or risk, excuse me, is we are seeing practically a very particular case that an Arduino-like device that is struggling towards the memory consumption, and by that developers practically cannot use SSL at all, which means they are prone to cyber attacks by design. proving, again, the point of the discussion, of course. What kind of remediation we can come up with that? Of course, as Chris and Charles said yesterday, first of all, if it was possible to sit down together before we are even making up a board and even choosing a chip, let's make it a discussion before we go on. This is not, as I said, not as trivial as it may sound. Maybe this, by the way, a Chinese company, maybe those kind of systems are not even with the same rule. Maybe on different parts of the world, maybe it was invented without thinking about MQTT altogether, and what is the intention of it. But that is exactly the point. Because of those dilations and those geographic constraints, maybe something else, this is practically a very possible thing to happen. And I would also say that this is very common in hardware, because hardware is not fixable so easily unless you have some kind of FPGA, that the FPGA can be easily customized on the fly. There are many systems that now supports those kind of things. That said, if the environment, as this example exemplifies, is constraining you from doing something that you really like to do, the only option that you will have is back to the blueprints and reconfigure and redesign a board, which means a lot of money, and another round of PCBs, another round of R3s, confusion of the market, et cetera, et cetera. No one wants that unless you are, masochistic in any case. But also, of course, the revision of the board wasn't just for security. So once we are just looking at the broad scheme of things, of course, there will be constraints no matter what. In this case, we also saw a constraint that practically directly impacted security, and that's the first case. So conducting an architecture review can be a step that we can do. The architecture review will be able to at least raise those kind of questions, maybe to be able to, let's say, on R2 instead of R3, revision 2 instead of revision 3, to fix the problem. And second, try to also find those kind of feature requests as early as you can. This, as I said, can be by embedding yourself as an application engineer within the engineering systems and engineering teams. And also, you can also build some kind of automation. We do it ourselves, by the way, in our company, on our Jira tickets to see by sampling words and finding interesting keywords to be able to know what kind of features are going on, and if something can be related to security, will be involved in terms of security design as well. Up to the second type. Second type is compatibility and law, which is a very specific case which we saw more than once in terms of regulations. Regulations and standards in general can define, again, non-maliciously, things that are either outdated, because those kind of things takes time. There are some exceptions, that some standardization effort and regulations took very, very little time. We also experience that today in globally, in the US specifically. We have seen a rise on SBOM, if you're familiar with that, and other supply chain mechanics that are getting rapidly developed, which is very, very nice to see. So kudos to them. But most regulations takes time. It takes time because it takes time to ask the market, to involve participants, to draft things, to have requests for comments, et cetera, et cetera. And this time also impacts the relevancy of those kind of standards or regulation. It doesn't mean that it gets, as soon as it gets out of the door or out of the oven, it will be invalid, but it also means that the clock is against those kind of regulations. And if you need to refine a regulation and maybe reinvent it in some way, it will also take time. Not mere days or months, maybe more than that, but it is also a factor of how severe is the situation about the standard or regulation. So it's usually those kind of threats and risks are coming because of this kind of time dilation, the delay between the time the market's consuming the regulation and then following the regulations takes time as well. PCI is very known as a very popular regulation and standard that takes time to develop, and each iteration of it took about a year and a half, 18 months to the market to comply with it. And they also know that because they are also not enacting the regulation at the day it's out. They give, if I remember correctly, PCI 3 was given about 2 years to comply to all of its features and about a year and a half to comply with some of the features, the severe ones. And this is something that also says if something happens within those kind of time frames, in terms of security advancements, or insecurity advancements, I should say, that this also affects compatibility in this case, and security risks altogether. In this case, the case I chose, and again, I am not nitpicking, but a very severe case, which was in Netscape. This is the first name dropping I'm going to do. This is not related to Netscape, but Netscape was very, very involved in that. If you don't know, SSL was invented by the Netscape guys. One of the many inventions and innovations they did for us to become to be using the internet as we are using today. That said, not everyone were very excited about all of those features. Specifically, and we are not going to fight over it today, because books have been written about this kind of paragraph. You can see it from there. I can see it from here. But if I'm trying to put it on the board, this is an exclamation, a disclaimer for a new feature, or maybe to adhere to a regulation. The regulation is U.S. arms trafficking and regulations around that. Which means that if you can read it now, this version supports international security with RSA, public key cryptography, MD2, MD5, RC4. Now, before you laugh about the MD2, this was when MD2 and MD5 was considered okay. So this is not the point. The point is what does it mean? Supports international security. Someone knows what is international security? I think that some of you know, but are afraid to raise your hand, so I will say. International security is a chapter in this regulation that because RSA, the algorithm, not the company, the RSA algorithm is a cryptographic algorithm that was invented in asymmetric control in order to be able to exchange keys, and by that be able to build a very, very difficult to crack or impossible to crack in those times cryptography by any means, almost. I won't say any means, but almost any means at the time. We are talking around 94, 96 even. It's still the early stages of the internet, early stages of browsers, early stages of security of the internet itself. So international security means that the chapter, if you would like to have this kind of cryptographic scheme, again, the RSA scheme, the asymmetric exchange, etc., you'll need to comply to US law if you are from the US. Netscape was considered a US institute. And by that, you won't be able to transfer the algorithm for RSA unless you are downgrading the RSA strength in order to not be considered an ammunition. Now, this is a very difficult for us now in 2022. We can't even fathom what it means because everyone are using those kind of encryptions and even better encryptions than then. We are way past RC4 and MD5, as you know. But back then, it was a very scary moment for many people in the government and others that were saying, okay, we can't use, this was called the crypto wars. As I said, books have been written about it. And you can't use the RSA, the strong encryption schemes in RSA, so you need to downgrade the RSA schemes. During the crypto wars, there was some crazy people that actually even wrote a Perl algorithm on their hands, which means they cannot exit the country because they are considered weapons. And also printed on shirts, so the shirts could not be shipped outside of the US because, again, the shirts are considered munitions from now on. This guy, which should be mentioned in every time you are talking about crypto wars, is Phil Zimmermann, is the inventor of PGP that uses RSA encryption as well. And he was almost went to jail because of that. And this is a very long story, non-related, so I will stop here. But the important part of it is that there was an international chapter if you would like to use this kind of PGP. Now, no one said it was intentionally downgraded, like to be able to harm someone. I'm not saying that. But in this case, the regulation says that if you would like to be considered something that can be shipped outside of the US, because Netscape, of course, is shipped outside the US, because me in Israel could have downloaded Netscape as well, that means that it is shipped internationally, no matter how you look at it. Nowadays, of course, this is a very long history from now. We are way past that. One thing to consider is that what happened in 2015. Now, the scheme itself was resident by OpenSSL and others pretty much by default, but disabled by default as well. Because again, in order to have that, they still had those kind of exported, or what is called RSA export in short, exportable schemes for encryption. So it was kept into the code, but was disabled. And no one really used it unless you don't know what you are doing and you are enabling everything. I saw it with my own eyes that people have been doing that without intention. Freak attack is a specific vulnerability invented in 2015 that attack this kind of scheme that causes servers that communicate through RSA or through SSL/TLS to be downgraded to exportable keys. And by the technology that we had in 2015, it was very easy to crack for anyone, not just for a military or intelligence complexes. So the freak attack was a specific downgrading attack against about 10% of the internet. It was exploitable to the 10% of the internet at the time. 9.5, if I remember correctly, of the servers online were exploitable by this kind of attack, which means anyone with a man-in-the-middle interjection could have been downgrading our connections to any kind of 10% of the sites in the internet, and by that can read our messages. Again, this is a compatibility issue, a regulation issue, and something that we would like also to emphasize here. The example, as I said, US laws in the 90s were pretty strict, and in order to be able to even ship software, whatever it means today, outside of the US, you have to comply with that, so exportable keys were part of the deal. What we can do with that, especially on compatibility when we see this kind of things, standard in general and compatibility for that, there is a rectified laws. In this case, the laws were rectified around 96 to 98. There was a diminishing of those kind of exportable issues. And also, again, in 2006, we saw more and more laxing of those kind of protocols. So first of all, be aware of the latest regulation, and if there is kind of a errata or addendum, go ahead and read that. Usually there is some very good things to know about it. If you are not familiar with it, consult with a professional around those kind of regulations. They will usually be able to tell you a lot about those kind of happenings. Sometimes it's very difficult to follow, and that's why I'm saying that. The third one is that if there is a known security vulnerability that you are aware of your kind of, but you have to have that in terms of compatibility, and we'll touch upon that in a second on the third part. You have to have this kind of vulnerability in your, let's say, software or system, but you can maybe find another way to be either also compatible, but also in terms of compensating controls to be secure as well. Let's go on with the third type, and maybe the most explosive one. The third type is, of course, someone influencing your design intentionally in order to harm you. This can be done by, you can think of any kind of lobbyists that would like to influence someone in the decision-making chain, or maybe someone that is within the decision-making chain that can really maybe manhandle someone in order to influence it. And as I said, a real world example will show you what I'm talking about specifically. The last part of that sentence is that one might think about it as an APT, a proper APT on the design level, which is something I know is not easy to say because APT need to be proved that is an advanced, a persistent threat, but also think about how much effort should be put on those kind of processes in order to succeed to influence that. We're not talking about a grocery store that is in charge of where to put the milk. We are talking about standards. We are talking about maybe something else in terms of software that is shipped and used by millions or by most of the world sometimes. And to be able to influence that, you'll need a great force behind you. So the example here, and I'll mention one more thing that we mentioned before. It's, as I said, a bit explosive, so I will tread lightly on that. First of all, the history of this kind of incident is a bit complex. There is a timeline that has been written on Wikipedia, if you like, but the timeline itself is not clear on everything because we don't know everything at the end. But in general, we can think about it as that. We have something called dual EC-DRBG, a very good name, very catchy. Everyone knows it. I'm kidding, of course. It's not catchy. It's not supposed to be catchy. The long name of it, the long hand is dual elliptic curve deterministic random bit generator, which in simple terms mean that elliptic curve is a subset of cryptographic schemes. By the way, nowadays it has a renaissance in these kind of areas around package managers as well. But back then, we are talking about early 2000s, the elliptic curves in general, the schemes that were considered advanced schemes that were we didn't figure out yet all of the math, and it was still under research either on universities and others as well. And of course, everything cryptographic is complex, so I'm not going into the details right now, but it's fascinating by itself how the algorithm works. Within this algorithm, we'll return to that because it's very important. There was a couple of, I will call it for now, bugs. Because every kind of algorithm of cryptographic schemes, we'll find bugs on them and move on. That happens to every kind of scheme, every kind of hashing scheme, every kind of encryption scheme. We found bugs, we find vulnerabilities, we find weaknesses, and we are getting stronger on that, and every time we're reinventing that. So until now, dual EC-DRBG is just an algorithm. In order to symmetrically and asymmetrically be able to communicate back then it was through SSL, but in general, cryptographic schemes. It was baked into NIST. Now, NIST is, of course, the institution itself, National Institution of Technology of the US Gov. It was inserted into 890A, which is a very important standard of cryptographic schemes. By that, it recommended some random number generators, which means the algorithms themselves that you should use. Now, pay attention to that because NIST is not only affecting the US. NIST is affecting the whole world, practically, maybe minus some other superpowers. But in general, we all read NIST all over the world, Europe, Middle East, Asia, any way you can think of, this is not the US, and we reiterate on that, transform it and translate it into maybe customizing to the local government and reusing the NIST standards worldwide. So that's why it's not just to a specific sector. Not only that, NIST is directed primarily to US Gov vendors. But nonetheless, first of all, many of the vendors are US Gov vendors as well. And second, as I said, indirectly affecting the whole industries that you can think of, because those kind of industries are, again, reading the NIST, it's a very respectable body. So reading it and reiterating over it and come with their own interpretation and maybe some kind of a downgrading of it. So this is first, it was baked into 898, not into Rev 1, we'll get into that. And it was called Recommendation for Random Number Generator using deterministic random bit generators, specifically the DRBG part. It was one of the only two crypto schemes that were also valid for FIPS. FIPS is also a certification that you get if you would like to be a vendor that sells cryptography and you want to be considered on FIPS. This means that you are coming to as a vendor to a consumer and says, you want to buy my software? Hey, wait, I'm the US Gov or someone that needs to comply to FIPS. I want to comply with FIPS. Are you? Here's my certification. Yes, I can buy. Thank you very much. Goodbye. But in this case, FIPS 142 is actually was a very important milestone. Many used it at the time. And again, if you would like to consider yourself one of those, you will have to build your own. One of those cases, quite importantly, was OpenSSL that wanted to be compliant with the FIPS, and they were compliant with FIPS 142. The second part of the equation here is RSA, the company RSA this time. RSA had a library named BSafe and also an appliance that is also constituting encryption. It was a very good one in terms of its market share as well. And in 2004, they defaulted to dual EC DLBG. The one thing I didn't tell you until now is many things, but one of that is that it was very controversial from the beginning, almost from the beginning. If it was, let's say, invented in 2004, and we are not sure about that, the records doesn't show any early advancements, but we don't know. In 2007 and also in 2006, there was some community uproar on that. Very respectable researchers from one of the universities in the US have researched the dual EC DLBG algorithm and concluded that it has a very important weakness. We cannot use this kind of algorithm. They weren't alone. Public figures, if you know Bruce Schneier, for example, is maybe the frontman poster boy for anything cryptography and popularization of cryptography for everyone. He also was against using dual EC DLBG just because it was weak. It had some weaknesses. We are not going into the math now, but weaknesses, it means that in elliptic curves that can be broken or totally disrupted. Now, the non-technical term is backdoored, but we are getting into that. Now, until now, we are living in a dream that all of that is just a bug, and everything is fine, and it's just an ugly scheme. Don't use it. The thing is that once you have that, and as I said, BSafe is using it by default for now, by default, against everything the community says. Why so happens that in 2014 it was revoked from SP 898? We'll get in a second. This is a memo. OpenSSL, once the researchers that I just mentioned disclosed the bug, they said two things. We know about the bug. They wrote a very good explanation here. I put a bit.ly link if you'd like to copy or something. So they wrote a memorandum about all of the incident, the bug itself, what does it mean, and they said, okay, listen, we are FIPS 142 compliant. We want to be, changes into the code on those kind of chapters without revoking 142 for now will be difficult. All we are doing right now, we are not fixing the bug. Not fixing the bug. Just don't use it. We're not using it by default. We are advising you not to use it. If you really want, here is how you can change the code, but this means that you might be invalid for FIPS 142. Quite amazing, but again, quite reasonable. The effort and time that it will take OpenSSL to rectify the code in this case is huge, huge. And going through the process again of being validated and being certified for 142, and in between you will lose market share, and OpenSSL, not just now, but every time was the leader of SSL adoption in the world, maybe with two other strong competitors. But in general, I'm sure that you all know about OpenSSL, for example. So this was, until now, as I said, a bug. Now, the dramatic pause is with intention because I'm saying it with a heavy heart. In around 2014 and then in 2015, together with the Edward Snowden leaks, there was revealed that there was an operation going on the NSA. A very similar operation was going on the British equivalent of the NSA as well. That all of its intention in the NSA, it was called the Bull Run. And the intention of this kind of project or effort by them is to compromise encryption schemes in the world. Back to this screen, for example, for a second. What happened there is two cases. One, they came to RSA Be Safe and said, this is allegedly, because there is a debate about this kind of this is in question, but there is no question that RSA implemented dual ECDRBG, and there is no question that NSA tried to convince them to do so. There is also a very important part that I omitted until now, that the SP890A, or before that there were a couple of more standards there that was less, I would say, much more technical and less of a regulation, an ANSI standard. The NSA was heavily invested in that. And once they got to the NIST standard, which usually means that you are together with other professionals and you're writing together the standard, they became the sole contributor to the cryptographic recommendation. And also it was revealed that by the Snowden leaks that they knew about the weakness beforehand. And the last thing is that, just to note, RSA Be Safe at the time has had a market share of beyond our imagination today. RSA was holding the market in terms of enterprise. I would say loosely every enterprise on the planet used some kind of RSA Be Safe implementation. And by that, just think about those kind of things. What you can think, where your imagination goes with that. Now, also pay attention that this document was written after Snowden leaked the documents, but it still wasn't revealed that the NSA had all of that collusion, allegedly, with RSA. But on another day, there were a couple of, more than a couple, of tabloids that wrote about the incident and said that the NSA had been deliberately weakening international encryption standards. By that, the Guardian, that of course you should know about Glenn Greenwald, he was holding most of the Snowden documents at the time, and also the NSA able to foil basic safeguards of privacy on web. So the last part, as I said, this is allegedly because RSA said that never happened. So I of course don't know anything about that. And part of the deal here is to understand is that this was an influential effort, an intentional one, in order to sabotage a standard, and by that influence the majority of the world that uses this kind of encryption schemes. Especially those that I was a consultant back in the day, and when I was consulting for cryptography, this is one of my passions and expertises. I would happily advise, listen, there is a FIPS 142, you can read a document, see what NIST is doing about it, and I wasn't the only one. With this kind of disclaimer, exclamation, worst case, don't use that, this is the community opinion in general, but when that broke, everything turned around. And part of that was that NIST, of course, just rewrote the NIST standard, and it was omitted. And of course, no one is using it today, I hope. And by that, again, I'm returning back to home. In the essence of it is that we do have malicious influence into something that is impacting in a global scale. Now, pay attention to the last thing I'm saying here is that pay attention to how much time it took us to rectify a standard that was written as a draft in 2004 until it was redrawn from the NIST, just from the NIST draft in 2014. That means that more time after that, it took people and organizations to revert back their configurations, to check their systems to see if everything is in line with the new algorithm, with the new recommendations. It takes time. We're talking about maybe a decade just to rectify that. And how much of that was exploited in this midterm, we don't know. OpenSSL said that they had this kind of a check that practically no one, unless they were very intentful about it, no one used OpenSSL with this scheme. Again, this was disabled by default, so they have a very good ground to say that. But as I said, as a consultant, I saw more than once that people that are less knowledgeable just implementing all the things, clicking on buttons, and everything is turned on, including dual EC DRBG. But a minority of them, of course. So, in conclusion to that, we have discussed influence decision making and to be able to influence maliciously on that, so you will have advantage. There are multiple others, and as I said, I didn't want to pick someone specifically, so I won't repeat the names. But there are other incidents of such that someone either bribed or be able to influence a path of either encryption keys or other terms of data protection that were invented in order to gain advantage to one group over another. And those are the knowns. I want to leave you with a scary thought. What are the unknowns for us today? I really don't, of course, this is part of it. We don't know, and it's very scary to think about those kind of things going on today, and probably there are, statistically. And by that, this is something that we should all take together to think about how can we rectify that. So this is also part of the remediation. I can talk about it, by the way, extensively, because I'm trying to make up a working group around how can we also monitor what kind of processes and standards are going where, who is in charge of that, what are the power struggles between them, maybe the weighted decision making around that, but it's still in its youth. If you are one of those people that are passionate about it, please contact me. I'll be happy to have you on this working group as well. And remediation. Standard institutions diversify their writers. You can also make an excuse for yourself to just read who is on the paper that is written, and you don't have to be going it as sheep. You just read the paper. You understand who was in the community in the drafting of the paper. Unless it's a community-driven, which many of the standards are, unless it's a community-driven, we should be able to see who exactly influenced what and where, at least to some degree that will benefit you. By the way, the NIST standard I just mentioned just included 2 names. So this is a very good hint of something that can go wrong in this case, or at least use the word risk in this case. On an organizational level, use different special matter experts from different disciplines or even divisions. Many times when we are building something together, someone wants to influence something else. Again, I'm calling it maliciously. It doesn't mean that they come with knives or something, but they are trying to influence something in order to maybe the UI guys don't want to work too hard. Maybe even that can influence the security. And I'm not exaggerating too much, because it also means that if they have a React, let's say it's a real world example for a moment. If we have an outdated React version on our website, we are discussing how to change that, but someone colludes with another and say, let me forget about the React upgrade because it will take us 6 months and let's move on. Most of the companies, of course, are not trying to demolish themselves, but this is also something that can influence that maliciously, but not in an intention to, in this case, to read all of your stuff online, but also to influence it by that you have something else in mind in terms of against the security of your consumers or the data or application. And the third thing is that if you have the opportunity to look at different standards and have the common denominator between them, this is also something that is very good practice. So you'll be able to just make out the noise and at least to have a second opinion about what is right. And the chances are that those kind of influences will be much more difficult to influence both, unless they're not independent from each other. As I said, NIST derivatives exist all the time, so be aware of that. And I really hope that those kind of incidents at this scale we don't have currently. In conclusion, as we said, we have 3 different examples and different types of risks The first one is an environmental constraint. We can fight that. We can understand there is environmental constraint. We can understand there is a time delay between practically designing the system, especially on systems that are very rigid in their architecture. As I said, hardware is a very common one, but you can think of other rigid examples as well. Second, compliance and law. Be able to know where is the compliance sits right now, how old is the compliance, maybe there is a new version, stuff like that. And thirdly, as we said, malicious influences are always there as well. In terms of remediation, we also discussed that, either architecture review, be knowledgeable of the new standards, and thirdly, diversify the experts and be able to be able to see if there are diversification of those kind of experts on those kind of standards. If not, this is a risk you should consider. That's all I'm saying. The bottom line, the design step is crucial and can constitute a limit on any future direction taken and decision left for coding. And I'm stating again, even in cloud-native applications, you will have these kind of delays, you will have those kind of disconnects between design and code. This is inevitable. And there are many, many examples by day-to-day that we also, by the way, by day I'm developing software, and I also see that, and we are working very, very agile and cloud-native, and every buzzword on the bingo board. And still, we have those kind of delays, and we will need to consider that as well and to work together. And that's it. We should remember the bottom line, of course, on the malicious actors, that they will be there. They will try their best to influence that, either from our own people, maybe from the outside, who try to influence our decisions, and we'll need to diversify in order to know better, and of course to be aware. This is one example of many. Be aware of that existence, and by that, fight that back. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you again for LastCon to be having me, and I'm opening for questions.